In 1990, 1% of Americans said they had no close friends. By 2024, that number was 17%. That's not a coincidence. That's not screens or personality or some vague cultural decline. When something shifts that dramatically, over that many people, over that many decades, you stop looking at the individual and you start looking at the system they're living inside. And when you look at the system, one thing becomes very hard to ignore. Your city was designed to make you lonely, not by accident, not through negligence, through a century of legal decisions, planning philosophies, and economic incentives that, layer by layer, dismantled the physical conditions that make human connection possible. Here's what that actually means. Before we had suburbs, American cities looked different. Not just aesthetically, structurally. You had homes above shops, corner stores within walking distance, workplaces close to where people lived, sidewalks that actually led somewhere, streets where you'd run into the same faces, day after day, without scheduling it. Sociologists call these kinds of spaces third places. Not home, not work. The cafe, the plaza, the community hall, the stoop. The places where people encountered each other sideways. Not because they planned to, because the city put them there. That infrastructure of informal contact is what built social trust. Not grand community events, not organized programs. Just proximity, repetition, and the low-stakes friction of daily shared life. And then in 1926, a court case changed everything. The case was called Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, and it established something called Euclidean zoning. The principle was simple: separate land into distinct use categories. Residential over here, commercial over there, industrial further out. 2 years earlier, Herbert Hoover's Department of Commerce had already drafted a model zoning law and distributed it to every state in the country. By the 1940s, this wasn't just a local quirk, it was national policy. The original reasoning sounded sensible. Keep factories away from homes, reduce noise, manage congestion, protect property values, and for some of those goals, it worked. But something else happened alongside it. When you legally separate where people live from where they work, shop, and gather, you don't just reorganize land, you reorganize daily life. The spontaneous encounter disappears. You don't walk past the cafe on the way to anything anymore. You drive past it in a sealed car from one designated zone to another. The city stops being something you move through. It becomes something you commute across. Robert Moses understood this dynamic better than anyone, even if he'd never describe it that way. As New York's dominant urban planner through the mid-20th century, Moses built highways through the middle of functioning neighborhoods. He cleared dense, mixed-use blocks and replaced them with superblocks and expressways. His vision of the modern city prioritized vehicle throughput. The pedestrian was, at best, an afterthought. Meanwhile, post-war suburban developers, backed by federal mortgage programs and the expanding highway system, were building a new spatial model from scratch. Residential subdivisions here, shopping malls there, office parks further out, each category separate, each destination requiring a car. They sold it as progress, quiet streets, private yards, a home of your own. And for the people who could afford it, especially white middle-class families with access to those federal programs, the appeal was real. But the trade-off was invisible until it wasn't. Children couldn't walk anywhere. Neighbors stopped meeting by accident. Local commerce hollowed out. Public life moved indoors or disappeared. The geography of daily life contracted into a pattern of house, car, parking lot, car, house. Here's where it gets more specific. Planning researchers describe the cost of this system as forced consumption. In automobile-dependent areas, transportation consumes around 18.5% of household income. Analysts estimate U.S. sprawl costs roughly $1 trillion annually when you factor in infrastructure, fuel, vehicle ownership, and the sheer distance residents are required to travel just to meet basic needs. Sprawl monetizes distance. The further apart everything is, the more you have to spend to reach it. And it's not just transportation. Think about what else sprawl does to daily spending. Big box retail works because it's built on cheap land at the edge of cities, assumes customers arrive by car, and optimizes for bulk, infrequent purchases. The walkable corner store that sells you one onion on a Tuesday evening? doesn't survive in a landscape designed around parking lots and minimum lot sizes. The urban form shapes the transaction. The transaction shapes the economy, and the economy gets built back into the urban form. Now overlay that with what happens to public space inside this system. In cities across the US and UK, something called hostile architecture became standard practice. Benches divided by armrests so no one can lie down. Sloped surfaces that make sitting uncomfortable after 5 minutes. Spikes on ledges. Boulders placed to prevent gathering. Public toilets removed entirely so that sitting somewhere for an hour without buying anything becomes physically difficult. The Camden bench, introduced in London in 2012, was designed explicitly to prevent sleeping, skateboarding, lingering, and long stays. This isn't just about homelessness, it's a philosophy of space. The ideal user of public space under this model is someone passing through, someone spending, someone going from A to B efficiently. Anyone who stays, rests, gathers, or lingers without a commercial purpose is, by design, made uncomfortable. In New York City, there are hundreds of privately owned public spaces, plazas, and atriums that developers built in exchange for zoning benefits. Many of them have quietly added rules, design features, or private security to discourage exactly the kind of open, unstructured gathering that makes a public space useful. The city markets itself as vibrant and social. It removes the benches. A 2023 study of young adults across California, Illinois, and Texas found that closures of libraries and community centers, the kinds of spaces where people could simply be without purchasing, led directly to deteriorating mental health and reduced social ties. The effects were worse for marginalized groups who had fewer private alternatives. This is the mechanism. You remove the third place. The informal encounter disappears. The weak social tie, the neighbor you recognize, the face you see weekly, the casual conversation with a stranger, doesn't form. And weak ties, it turns out, aren't weak in the ways that matter. Research consistently shows they're central to mental health, civic engagement, and a sense of belonging. When you remove the physical infrastructure of those encounters, you don't just inconvenience people, you atomize them. None of this required a conspiracy. It didn't need one. What it needed was a convergence of interests. Zoning laws that protected property values, highway engineers optimizing for throughput, suburban developers building at scale, retailers whose business models required parking, city managers who preferred predictable consuming visitors over unpredictable lingering residents. Each decision made sense in its own context. Each one chipped away at something that doesn't show up on a balance sheet until it's gone. What they built together was a city optimized for transactions. And a person who has no third place, no informal public life, no spontaneous daily encounters, that person fills the void somehow. Usually by consuming. Another streaming subscription. A restaurant with friends because there's nowhere free to meet. A gym membership because there's nowhere to walk. Another item purchased online because the local shop closed because the zoning code made it impossible to build near homes. The loneliness economy and the loneliness geography are the same system running in parallel. Here's what makes this hard to reverse. For millions of homeowners, the suburban model isn't just where they live. It's where their wealth is stored. Single-family zoning suppresses supply, which inflates prices, which means that the house is often the household's largest asset. Any policy that opens up density, adds apartments, or reintroduces mixed use can feel like a direct financial threat. The politics of zoning reform are brutal precisely because the stakes are that personal. But the cost of not changing it keeps compounding. The loneliness keeps spreading. The infrastructure keeps aging. The commutes keep lengthening. The third places keep closing. The city was never neutral. Every bench removed, every plaza privatized, every suburb carved into isolated residential pods. That was a decision, made by someone for reasons. Some of those reasons were about order. Some were about profit. Some were about race and class, dressed up in the language of land use. And the result is a built environment where spontaneous human connection has been, layer by layer, made harder. Where meeting someone without a plan requires money. Where sitting somewhere without purchasing anything makes you suspicious. Where the map of land use has become quietly and deliberately a map of isolation. 17% of Americans have no close friends. They didn't choose that. It was built for them.